Hi everyone, this is Matthew Janda for Card Winners, and I'm here with my Quickie series, defending against the 3 bets on the button, part 5. So first off, a quick Quickie update. I have been getting a lot of questions regarding my Theory and Flopzilla series. This video is made after my Important Theory Concept Series Part 1 and Theory Patch Number 1, so I will assume you have watched them rather than try to be very repetitive. Many people have requested we discuss turn and river play in addition to flop play. From now on, we will when using 45 to 50% button opening ranges. Whether or not I'll do wider than that button opening ranges, I don't know yet. These button opening ranges are pretty standard, yet are still very wide ranges. It will start to get very difficult to defend enough so the opponent cannot properly bet any 2 cards on the flop. Just because our opponent can profitably bet any 2 cards on the flop does not mean we are being exploited. This will be discussed in more detail in Important Theory Concepts Part 2. For now, simply understand letting our opponent properly bet any 2 cards does not imply exploitation. It's much more complicated than that to figure out whether or not your opponent should be able to properly bet with any 2 cards. It's talked about a lot in other videos. I'm aware a lot of people are confused about that concept. It's going to be talked in more of the Concept Theory series, so probably look for it in Important Theory Concepts Part 2. And whether or not we can defend enough to prevent him from being able to properly bet any 2 cards will be discussed as we randomly generate flops. So even though I know we haven't gone over this in a whole ton of detail, I am going to give my opinion on whether or not this looks like a board texture where our opponent probably can bluff any 2 cards and make money. Other important math. If the opponent bets 50% of the pot on all 3 streets, we end up felting 70% times 68.5% times 67% equals 32% of our flopping range. This is a very wide felting range, and it is not like raise pots where we often felt only 21% of our range total. How much extra we defend to prevent free rolling changes the frequencies very little. Defending an extra 3 to 5% on the flop or turn is fine and not a big deal. So 62% times 60% times 57% or 70% times 68.5% times 67%, depending on whether or not we're in a 3-bet pot facing a half pot size bet or a raise pot facing around a 75% pot size bet. How much extra I added to prevent free rolling was more or less just an educated guess. It doesn't matter if you want to change these by a few percent. Our 3-bet flatting range on the button is not all that strong, yet we are both up against a strong range and we need to felt wider than we would in a raised pot. This makes defending against 3 bets with a wide button opening range very difficult because, once again, you're not only having to felt wider than you usually would because your opponent's bet sizes are smaller relative to the size of the pot, but you're also up against a very strong range and a very polarized range, and as I'm sure you're aware, it is hard facing bets from polarized ranges. We'd much rather be the player with a polarized range. We just simply don't always have that option. For these reasons, my guess is a theoretical button opening range is significantly tighter than a lot of very good players use. I'll probably have a stronger opinion about it at the end of the series, however. So I know when I played, I opened over half of my range on the button at both 1-2 and 2-4, and I folded a ton to 3 bets. And while I don't think I was playing perfectly by any means, I did think that was profitable and I could get away with it because people weren't punishing me aggressively enough, and I would just simply tighten my ranges when I did have 1 or 2 good players in the blinds. So in theory, I think you're probably going to have to use tighter button opening ranges than I would recommend, especially if you're playing micro limits or small stakes. You probably want to open the button wider now than you actually can in theory. That's my guess based on the math I'm seeing in my own personal experience. For a 45% button open. For a 45% button open, we will assume our opponent expects to lose on average 4.5 big blinds when his worst 3-bet bluff is called. He risks 9 big blinds pre-flop by 3-bet bluffing. If we 4-bet 5% of the time, this means we must call. Now, before I pop up the math, keep in mind there is more than one way you could write this equation and get the right answer, get the right frequency. This is the way I think is the clearest way to write it, where it kind of makes the most sense and is the easiest to visualize. So for a 45% button open, our opponent loses 9 big blinds, 5 divided by 45, because we are going to 4-bet him 5% of the time, and then he's going to fold to our 4-bet. Our opponent is going to lose 4.5 big blinds, x divided by 45, because we're calling him x, and when we call, our opponent loses on average negative 4.5 big blinds because he's out of position with the worst hand in his 3-bet bluffing range. So we're going to solve for x, which is pretty much our sort of call frequency here. Then our opponent is going to win 4.5 big blinds 45 minus x minus 5, because 45 minus x minus 5 divided by 45, that's how often we're folding when our opponent 3-bet bluffs. So all that has to equal 0 to make our opponent indifferent to bluffing with that hand, and when we solve for that, we get x equals 15. So obviously 15 divided by 45, that means we're actually calling our opponent's 3-bet with 33% of our opening range, and 33 times 45 is going to get us a number. That through the magic of editing, so we're defending 33% of our opens by calling. We thus open our top 45%, 4-bet our best 2.5 to 3% of our hands. It depends on 4-bet sizing. Flat our next best 15%, and 4-bet bluff our next best 2 to 2.5%. So this is, once again, a simplified model. For example, you could always slow play some really big hands if you want. That's hard to tell whether or not that should actually happen in theory. But for the most part, when we open our top 45% of hands on the button, we're just going to obviously fold the bottom 55%. Then when we do face a 3-bet, we 4-bet our really, really, really good hands, call with our next 15% of hands, which will make up a third of our total opening range, and then we bluff the hands not quite strong enough to call. We're going to look for removal effects, and our 4-bet bluffs are going to be total around 2 to 2.5%. All this stuff is, of course, explained in much more detail in other videos. We're doing a quickie here, though, so we're going to move on. So I made the following 15.1% range, and this is what we're going to be using, and as I already mentioned, we're going to talk about not only the flop, but we'll also talk about the turn and the river. So I have our template here, and now we're going to randomly generate some flops. Alright, so the first one is 10 of hearts, 9 of clubs, 3 of hearts. So now we're going to write down the flop first. 10 of hearts, 9 of clubs, 3 of hearts. Total combos is 178, and then we're going to look for our desired combos defended. So 178 times 0.7 equals 178 equals 125. Should our opponent be able to properly bet any two cards? So now what we need to do is ask ourselves, does this look like a board texture where our opponent should be able to properly bet any two cards? And then if we don't want to contradict ourselves, we need to make sure we're defending at least this many combos. So when I see this board, I know that I would have a hand like pocket twos in my 3-betting range if I was in the big blind against the button. So I would not continuation bet pocket twos for a half pot size bet, because I would think I don't get enough folds and pocket twos is too weak of a hand. So in order to make that true for our opponent, we need to defend this many hands. So let's try to do that right now. First thing we need to analyze is the value raising range. The only hand that I would personally entertain the idea of value raising would be 10-9 suited. I think sets are strong enough to keep calling with and make our opponent fire a double barrel and we can jam the turn. And I think a hand like Ace-10 is not going to do well enough against our opponent's value betting range to justify the raise. While it does suck giving free cards, I don't think Ace-10 is strong enough to really felt here. Our opponent will usually get it in with better hands and draws. So I personally would not use a value raising range here. If you wanted to raise a few bluffs, 10-9 suited and some flush draws, I don't really care. I don't really think that's wrong. I have no idea if in theory 10-9 suited is a raise here. But as usual, I'm going to go with a value raising range of 0 here because I don't raise very much on the flop in 3-bet pots. So now we need to call 125 combos, which is a ridiculous amount of combos, yet we're going to give it a go. Alright, so let's start off just using Flopzilla as strongly as we can. So top pair, sure, I'm just going to write it as top pair plus 32. TP plus 32. So remember, we want to make the whole range 125. So we had, that was... and then middle pair is another 18 combos. So I'm going to write that as middle pair 18. Middle pair 18. That got us 50 total. And then we have weak pair. Okay, so we're not probably going to want to call with all of our pairs here. As you hopefully saw when you watched the Important Theory Concepts series, even though pocket sevens might have a lot of equity against our opponent's continuation bet, it pretty much is going to suck. So I don't want to try to defend pocket sevens or pocket sixes if I can get away with it. So we'll defend all this other sort of pairs, but we're going to have to kind of count. So let's see. I'm just going to go like this. Weak pair. Oh, weak pairs are none then. All right, so now we have to move on to gut shots and flush draws. So flush draws, we don't want to double count. So we have to make sure we're not counting the nines. So flush draws is going to get us another 17 minus, I think there's 6 nines. So 17 minus 6, so flush draws is going to be 11. Flush draws is 11. Alright, open and straight draws. That's 20 combos minus the 2 draws that were already flush draws, so that's 18 combos. Opening and straight draw is 18. So you can see this takes a while, and this is actually not nearly as tough as they can get when you're dealing with out-of-position Flopzilla stuff, which is way more combos. Alright, so let's do that. Then we have gut shots. Oh, that is a lot of gutters. Oh, that's a lot of gutters. Not really surprised, but still, damn. Okay, so that's 40 minus 4, so that's 36 gut shots. Wow. Alright, so gut shots, let's talk a moment about these. Gut shots might not have a whole ton of equity here, but they're going to play extremely well. At least the ones with the 2 overcards are going to. So if I have a hand like King Queen, I mean, maybe the turn in the river can come a way that will make it a fold on the river in theory. But for the most part, if you turn a king or a queen with king queen, you're probably going to have to fault it, I would guess. In practice, you probably can find a hero fold against some opponents. But king queen with the backdoor flush draw, a gut shot, and 2 overcards is going to be a really good hand that has equity that plays really well for the most part. So these gut shots are probably all defendable. Maybe we can get away with mucking like the 8-6 or the 7-6 of the non-clubs, non-heart. But for right now, I'm just going to throw them in and do a little bit of counting. Let's see what else we have. Any sort of really good overcards we want to defend? Probably. So let's do ace of hearts, queen. I'm just going to put ace, queen, 7, which means the 7 combos of ace, queen that have a runner flush. So that's ace of hearts, queen X, ace X, queen of hearts, and ace, queen of clubs. And then I'm going to probably put an ace-jack of clubs too, and then I'm going to count that while I freeze the screen for a second. And I counted 123 combos, which is close enough to our desired defending combos of 125 that we're going to roll with it. So most turn cards are going to put some pretty strong hands into our range, which is really fortunate because we only really have 50 made hands here. Ace-Queen might be able to get to Showdown as the best hand, but for the most part, only 50 made hands out of 125 defended combos. We're pretty weighted towards sort of weakish floats and draws, which isn't ideal, but since we are in position, that's going to be much more practical than it would be otherwise, because our opponent's either going to have to still bet pretty small in the turn when we can improve, or he'll have to make very, very large turn bets, where he's going to be risking so much money if he overbets the turn that it's okay if we have to fold a whole bunch of hands. So, not ideal, but hopefully in position, most turn cards will improve us, though our life will be difficult on something like a 5 of spades turn, but then we'll be really happy we slow played hands like 10-9 suited, pocket 10s, pocket 9s, because then we will actually have some really strong hands in our range, even if we don't have a whole lot. So I just went to random.org and randomly generated a turn card, and the first one I generated was the 7 of clubs, so I inserted it into our Flopzilla. And that, I think, is going to be an extremely difficult turn card to defend for a few reasons. The first is it didn't put a lot of strong hands into our range. It got 8-6 suited there, it got 9-7 suited there, and luckily we can have all 3 combos of 9-7 suited since the 9's a club as well. And that's pretty much it. So, it didn't put a lot of turn cards into our range, but what it did do is put a lot of draws into our range, in case we were floating with some, backdoor flush draws. It put a lot of draws into our opponent's range, but we didn't really need more draws. And since our opponent is going to get to bet first with around a pot and a half size bet left, this is a board texture where I think it's extremely effective for our opponent to jam on the turn, because he can jam all of his hard draws, he can jam all of his club draws, and he can jam all of his hands that are like ace-10 and better. And it's going to be extremely, extremely hard for us to call unless we just happen to have a few of our nutted hands here, which are relatively rare. And even if we do have a nutted hand, if he has a draw, he has a lot of outs. So I think this turn card is definitely a difficult one and definitely a good one for our opponent's range. But nevertheless, we're going to try to defend it. Okay, so I tried to take out the removal effects on the turn. You unfortunately have to count this because you don't call with every single hand combo on the flop. But I think the only turn cards that the 7 of clubs blocked were the 8-7 of clubs and the 7-6 of clubs. If I missed a combo, I apologize, but that's all I can see. And so now, if we want to make our opponent unable to bet any 2 cards on the turn for a half pot size bet, we want to defend 84 hand combos. That is a lot, and I think it's going to be relatively difficult, hard to defend. And as I said, our opponent might choose to overbet the turn, but we're just sticking with what we originally talked about, and assuming he makes a half pot size bet, although checking this for an overbet would be interesting as well. So this, I think, is a very difficult spot on the turn with a lot of hands in our range. because on one hand, if our opponent has a lot of draws, we really want to go all in on the turn because he might even still end up having to call with the draw that we beat. So if our opponent bets a half pot size bet on the turn, then we go all in on the turn with a hand like Queen 10, then our opponent can still call us with a hand like Ace Jack of Hearts, and then in that case, he has still a lot of outs, but we made him make a call and didn't let him see a free turn card, a free river card. So it's very difficult to tell here whether or not you should be jamming a hand like Ace 10 on the turn or King 10 on the turn, or whether or not you should be calling with it. And to be honest, I really don't know. I would probably jam with Ace 10 for value, even though I don't want to be called. I would probably jam with King 10 if I thought my opponent could have hands like Queen 10 or Jack 10, which he may or may not be able to. Personally, I wouldn't have them in my 3-betting range from the big blind. So it's quite difficult to say exactly what we should be value jamming with here and exactly, what we should be calling with here. But we'll try to do the best that we can. I would actually go as far as to say I think this is probably as tough of a turn spot as you can get in a 3-bet pot. Like, this is about as difficult a board as you're ever going to get. It's just what I randomly generated, so we're going to go for it. Okay, so value raising range on the turn. In practice, I'm going to just jam all my good hands here because when we jam, our opponent's getting such an incredibly good price, he's probably going to have to call with all of his draws. And then when we're jamming with our draws, our opponent has to call at an incredibly high frequency in order to make our draws not super, super profitable. So I think in practice, I mostly like jamming here, not letting my opponent get scared on the river, and then making him pay when he does have a draw. So let's just go ahead and do that. So value jamming range, 10-10, 9-9, 10-9 suited, 9-7 suited, 8-6 suited. So let's count all those. So that was 3, 6, 9, 13. No, I'm sorry. 3, 6, 8, 11, 15. So that's going to be 15 combos right there. And as I previously mentioned, I'm also going to jam Ace 10, even though I wouldn't hate it at all if you wanted to call. Same deal with King 10. If you want to jam it or call, I think they both can make sense against certain opponents, though I probably would jam Ace 10 and call King 10. So that's going to get us to 27 combos. And then now I'm going to add in a lot of draws to balance that out. So yes, if you wanted to get really tactical, you could try to calculate exactly how many draws you want to add in. But here I'm going to say for jamming like 27 hands, made hands for value, I'm going to try to throw in like maybe let's say 15 or 16 draws. That seems like a reasonable estimate. So I'm going to put in, let's see how many flush draws we have. Well, we can't see directly how many flush draws we have. We had 11 flush draws here. Some of those are going to be combo draws. Then some of our gut shots would be backdoor draws. So I'm going to actually just put, for the sake of a quickie, draws, 15 or so. So something like that to balance out the range, and that gets us to 42 hand combos. So now I'm going to write down my calling range because I'm not just going to jam everything on the turn. In practice, you might be able to do that against some players, but obviously I don't think that's recommended. When you jam the turn, your opponent usually won't have a very tough decision. So let's see. King 10 suited, Queen 10 suited, Jack 10 suited. We can do 9-8 suited, 8-7 suited. So that gives us to 15 hands right there. So these are all sort of marginal made hands that should beat all of the opponent's bluffs, but lose to all the opponent's value bets. So that's getting us to 57 hand combos, and then we could call with a bunch more draws here. I'm trying to see if there's any other made hands we can kind of make work. I would like some more made hands, but we can't always get what we want. So we could also have, I guess, like one combo of Ace 9 suited. That was like the, it's the backdoor flush draw one for Ace 9 of Hearts. I think you could do the same thing. So King 9 suited one. I'm gonna write heart for that. Queen 9, heart. Any other ones that I'm missing? Okay, so something like that. Oh, 10-8 suited. Almost missed that. Put that over here, actually. 10-8 suited, since that's a top pair. 18. So that gets us to 21 made hands right there. So I'm going to just put that in a little bracket right here. So that's 21 made hands. So that gets us 63. And then maybe we want to call with something like... I'm almost going to put draws 23 here. Okay, so I just re-edited this and found Jack 9 suited, which we can also call with, which is a gut shot in a middle pair. Not thrilled about calling with it, but I want to pause for a moment and really talk about this because we happened to just get about as difficult of a turn spot as we can to balance on the first hand where I started doing turn play in 3-bet pots on the button. And I still wanted to do this board because when I randomly generate a flop or a turn, I try to stick with it if possible and not just find easy spots. But this is confusing enough where I really want to make sure we have a good understanding of what's going on. So, we need to defend these 84 combos if we do not want our opponent to be able to properly bet any 2 cards on the turn. Now, whether or not that's true is very difficult to tell, but you don't want to let yourself have a contradicting thought process. So, if you were to see your opponent was betting this turn with something terrible, and betting the flop with something terrible, then it's not actually terrible unless you can find a way to defend this many hand combos if your range is this wide. Because if we think it's terrible if our opponent bets the turn when he has a very weak hand, like let's say ace queen off with no backdoor flush draw, then we have to be actually defending this many combos, otherwise ace queen makes money by betting, and ace queen will not make that much money by checking. So we needed to defend 84 hand combos in that case. So our calling range is a little bit more than half draws, or sorry, a little bit more than half made hands and 18 draws. That seems reasonable, especially since we're getting a very good price with our draws. And our value raising range looks relatively balanced at a glance. It's going to be very difficult for our opponent to call with a lot of his draws. We have a good amount of draws ourselves. You know, this number isn't going to be perfect, but it's going to be relatively close. So just keep that in mind. If you don't think your opponent should be able to bet the turn with any 2 cards, we have to defend this wide, even if when you're looking at this range right now, you might think like, oh, I don't really like defending with Jack-9 suited. Either do I. It's tough to defend with the Jack-9 suited. It's tough to defend with if we're defending, 33 draws, so we might have to have even some gut shots in here. We probably won't only have just queen. You know what? We might actually get away with only open and straight draws and 8s. But we're still going to be defending some hands that we're not in love with defending. I don't even love calling with queen jack on the turn, but we simply have to call that wide if we don't want our opponent to be able to bet any 2 cards profitably here. So as I said, this is an extremely, extremely difficult board to analyze, especially since I think the opponent should mostly be jamming the turn if he bets, because it's very hard for the opponent to bet fold when there's so many draws on this board. But it's a spot that's exceptionally difficult to analyze with Flopzilla. So if you have questions, you can ask me them in the thread for this video. But for the most part, if you want to get into like a long discussion over whether or not ace-10 is a jam or a flat, or whether or not, what draws we should be flatting with and what draws we should be jamming with, it's probably not going to be something I want to talk too much about because it's just so hard to tell here, and I don't really like the idea of, in a theory video, or even a Flopzilla when we're trying to make it very theory-based, I don't really like the idea of giving something like it's the correct answer when it's so incredibly hard to prove mathematically. So, on this turn, I'm calling with ace-10 sometimes, I'm jamming it sometimes based on my opponent. I'm calling with draws sometimes, and I'm jamming it sometimes based on my opponent. I'm pretty much going to randomize with my draws here, or whether or not, I jam or call with top pair, based on how my opponent plays. And it's not really going to matter to me so much exactly what 2 cards I'm holding here, because there's not that big of a difference between whether or not, I have ace-queen of hearts here, or whether or not I have, 7-6 of hearts. There's not a huge difference. It's probably going to be based on the opponent. So this quickie video has already run much longer than it was supposed to, so we're going to have to kind of quickly wrap it up, but I just wanted to say a few last words. So people were requesting that I do turn and river cards. I actually think the turn and the river are often going to be much easier to play than the flop, because you're dealing with such fewer combos. So just because we got an exceptionally difficult one here doesn't mean the turn and the river are always going to be very difficult, because a lot of the times you're going to have very balanced ranges on the turn and the river, and sometimes you're even going to find, wow, I have so many strong hands on the turn and the river, it's almost hard for me to fold enough, so I give him sort of any incentive to bluff. So don't think just because this one was very hard that your range is usually going to be very weak on the turn. That's not going to be the case if you're playing well pre-flop and on the flop. The next thing I wanted to say is, even though these board textures are very, very hard to do, and I really wouldn't recommend starting out doing these if you're first starting to use Flopzilla, if you are doing really well right now, it's kind of easy when you're running well and you think you're playing very well to think you're better than you actually are. Try doing some Flopzilla stuff on exceptionally difficult boards, and before you even write out all the combos after you spend, 15 or 20 minutes or longer than that if it takes you to play around with Flopzilla, make a guess. What do I think the worst hand I call with on the turn is? What do I think the worst hand I value raises? What do I think the hands I'm going to be bluff raising are? Make a guess before you actually try to write down all the combos using Flopzilla, and I bet you'll find on the very difficult boards, you're often going to be way off. So this is a good way to really sort of realize just how far you have to go. Even if you think you're doing really well right now and you know you're winning a lot of money, there's probably a lot of ways you can improve, because this stuff is just really, really hard, and we're not even in out of position stuff yet. So just keep all that stuff in mind. I'm sorry this video ran so long. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in a couple days, probably with the next Quickie, and hopefully this next board won't be nearly as difficult. Good luck. Bye.
Want to see your hands in the Quickie? Convert your hand history using the CR converter or post it in the forums. Send your link or questions to thequickie@cardrunners.com. Please include all relevant reads, stats, and information. The more info you provide,